So today, a memoir, Saeed Jones, How We Fight for Our Lives. And I would like to talk about a lot of aspects of this book, but particularly how it subverts one's expectations of or concepts of a genre, in that it queers the memoir, and also in terms of its form, certainly a very poetic memoir. Saeed Jones is also a poet. Not that we have to separate ourselves and define ourselves as poets or prose writers, but this is, I would say, both. And there are moments in here which read more like a poem. Some of them are lineated, some of the sections, but only in brief moments, in fragments. And there are also fragments of other texts, such as a fragment of a letter from his mother, as well as several quotes and excerpts from other books, including he seems to almost quote himself in the prelude is a poem by Saeed Jones, Elegy with Grown Folks Music, and it's about his mother dancing to Prince. Then a quote by David Mura, and then he dives into more, I guess, recognizable or standard memoir prose. But each section is of varied length and is dated time and place. So, for example, first chapter, May 1998, Louisville, Texas. And through the book, we follow what is expected, I would say, or what is more standard about this memoir is that it is a coming of age story, and also slowly, intermittently, a coming out story. But there's not one scene in which that occurs. It sort of, the narrator samples and tries and attempts and recycles through the coming out moment. And unfortunately, in many ways, we don't have a satisfactory or a climactic, revelatory coming out moment because of some unfortunate circumstances, including his mother's health, and also a sort of rebuttal or refusal to accept or discuss this moment. So yes, the coming of age story we would expect from a memoir. Many memoirs follow that pattern, and the coming out story to some extent. But the book also enters into a number of themes that I would say are more characteristic of a queer memoir, or the ways that queer authors have queered the memoir of more mainstream memoirs, or what a mainstream reader or audience might expect of a memoir. And that is that it finds the intersection between love and romance, coming of age, sex, family, motherhood, or in this case, being a son of a mother that he adores. But those intersect in odd ways, and in some cases, I think that the presence of all of those themes together, sometimes in the same chapter, sexual awakening, reckoning with the religiosity of a grandparent, loving and adoring and also fighting with one's mother, shame and denial and recognition. So all of those things together sometimes in one chapter. I think that is the abundance of confusion, I would say, at least in this book and many others in the books that we'll be discussing this module, I would say that hyper attention to confusion and ambiguity is actually a characteristic of queer literature across forms in terms of poetry, prose, memoir, fiction, nonfiction. Ambiguity, fluidity, confusion. I think that in many, I think you can find those elements in every chapter, and also the abundance of themes to reckon with, or questions of across all of the books that we'll be discussing. I think those qualities can be found. I would say they're qualities. I think that discomfort and tension are certainly fruitful in literature, and definitely fruitful in queer literature and in this book. So I'll give you a few examples, or I'll point to a few moments, and we'll do some close readings to illustrate this concept. And I would say certainly the final chapter, which I'll speak of at the end, is the most indicative of this clashing of themes and confusion, and also the sort of the merging of both expected and unexpected, of standard or mainstream and othering or fragmenting, fracturing, ambiguity, combining those two things together, or those two like sides of the spectrum of literature, the expected and the unexpected. Those all occur in the last chapter, but I'll save that for a moment. All right. So here's one particular example that I wanted to point to on page 86 of this book. And this is in a chapter in which the narrator has just arrived at college. And this is a college that he did not necessarily want to go to, but because he got a full scholarship through the debate team, he sort of had no out or no other choice, in the sense of it became his college of choice. He wanted to go to NYU and was accepted, and here he is in Kentucky at his second choice, which then becomes both a source of gratitude for the scholarship and also a source of lots of hardship and struggle. At the bottom of the page, he is describing a series of interactions in which, in the span of one day, he transforms his identity, both starts to reveal his true self and unpack the layers of masks and hiding and disguises that one puts up in defense, and then so he unpacks those and unwraps himself and reveals himself, and then he retreats back. And I'll read one line here, 2 lines. I closeted myself again. No one shoved me back in there. Maybe I'd just been standing in the doorway of that dusty closet, tripped, and somehow fell back inside. It shouldn't have been that easy to unbecome myself. The lies and omissions started rolling off my tongue, and I got more confident. I stopped mumbling and stuttering. I began meeting people's eyes, shaking their hands confidently, and introducing a person who I wasn't exactly, all while smiling. It felt good, like the first sip of an ice-cold beer after a long, hot day. I could be this person. I knew exactly how to be him, the kind of man who always feels the need to make it clear he doesn't swing that way. Louisville had raised me well. And I'm pronouncing that specifically Louisville, not Louisville, which I had thought it might have been pronounced, but on the previous page the narrator corrects one of the fellows in the dorm on its pronunciation. He's from Texas. All right. So that's a moment where I just wanted to focus on this rapid code switching, which I also think is indicative of both the paired and also conflicting themes of race, sexual identity, and how those create a double-headed hydra of a struggle for the narrator. And often the narrator code switches and makes it clear to the reader that both the form and the content of each section or chapter represent this switch, these codes that are being switched, these new styles, new identities, trying on new masks and new disguises, all the while not quite certain of what is beneath those masks, trying to find oneself. So finding oneself, yes, that is sort of a classic trope of a memoir, but I think the code switching and multiple masks that the narrator wears and takes off and puts back on again, I think that is one of the characteristics that I recognize often in queer literature. Mostly, I would say in queer prose, in the sense of a connected arc of a narrative, but all right, I'll leave it there for a second. So thinking about these two, this interlocking set of challenges that the narrator has to experience and survive, brings me back to the first chapter. And here's where I'm trying out my non-linearity of one aspect of queer literature, often non-linear experiments with chronology. Going back to the first chapter, page 4. So here the narrator and author bring in James Baldwin, thank goodness. And we see the younger narrator, junior high school, let's see. Sorry, I should have found the age. 12 years old. We see the 12-year-old narrator encountering books on his mother's bookshelves. And he tries to read Toni Morrison and finds it a little too dense or poetic or esoteric for his 12-year-old vision, but maybe also he has a hard time finding characters to identify with. He tries Alice Walker, who he says lost me a few pages in. Some girl was talking about the color. I'll just pause there and give a little censorship for YouTube. Okay, so Baldwin, he comes to Another Country, the book by Baldwin. And here he finds suddenly the abundance of the themes of James Baldwin's novel. He finds that he can identify with and associate with and resonate with. And here provides a nice little summary of what I was suggesting earlier about in queer literature. Often we find that these clashing of conflicting themes and tensions of finding community, fear of judgment, sex, confusion, apprehension, and coming of age, identification. So specifically in Another Country by Baldwin, he finds it both sexy and tragic. I think that combination also often is indicative of queer literature and certainly of this memoir. And he finds this, the eroticism and allure of the book also to include the, on the other hand, fear, consequence, forbidden desires. And this concept of the threats, both internal and external threats to these characters' safety. And he starts to ponder the extra burden or the extra threat of being a Black and gay young man. He's in this passage 12 years old. Partly because then he finds a photograph of his mother's, a friend from long ago, in the James Baldwin book. It's slipped into the book and it falls out, and he finds this photograph of a very intriguing man who has this smile that makes the 12-year-old narrator feel uncomfortable and also pulled in, drawn in, and curious. And he asks his mother about this man, and she says that it was a friend of hers who then died of AIDS. So in this case, they are not able to speak directly to the point of the fact that this man was gay. She doesn't say that. It doesn't allow them the opportunity to speak in a forthright manner. Instead, this conversation sends him further into fear and confusion. And then this brings me to my next point of a characteristic or something to look out for that can be indicative of queer literature, a component of queer literature, and that is the library. So I will point here to page 9, and I would say that maybe the library and finding oneself in the library is becoming a queer literary trope. In all positive, I highly approve. I don't mean cliche, I mean a very useful and recognizable trope of queer literature. A classic scene of the young narrator finding themselves and also researching what it means to be gay or queer or lesbian or whatever the narrator might be, or anything in between in the LGBTQIA spectrum, finding those terms and words and concepts in books at the library and not having necessarily a human guide or a mentor, but having to do that research, having to take on that research by themselves with the help of the community, their newfound community of authors and books. And we find this in Alison Bechdel in college. The narrator in her memoir herself goes to the library and researches both in the dictionary for terms and also finds a stack of books about being gay and lesbian and queer and takes them home and spends the rest of the semester deep involved in this stack of queer books. This is, I would say, stand-in for the rite of passage that might be found in a more stereotypical or mainstream novel or memoir. The rite of passage in this case is finding oneself in the library. I would also point to, actually it's an essay by Garth Greenwell about finding James Baldwin, Giovanni's room, in the back of a bookstore. So either library or bookstore, finding the queer shelf or the LGBTQ shelf in a library or bookstore. So here on page 9 of Saeed Jones's memoir, in the public library's air-conditioned coolness, I decided I knew better than to ask the wrinkled woman at the circulation desk where to find books about being gay. Instead, I slowly walked up and down each aisle, scanning book spines until I found what I was looking for. The first book that stopped me was for parents dealing with gay children. The introduction was worded like it was intended for readers coping with late-stage cancer diagnoses. I put the book back on the shelf, wrong side out. Eventually, I gathered 5 or 6 books and sat down on the floor with them in my lap. Like any teenage boy trained at reading things he shouldn't be, I looked both ways before opening any, then got up and grabbed a decoy off the shelf. It was a book about the sociology of boys. I kept it open on the second chapter and within reach in case someone I knew came down the aisle and I needed a quick alibi. While I was reading a book about defining homosexuality, I'll stop there, censorship for YouTube. So here I just wanted to point out that passage of kind of recognizing this location and scene as a possible component of queer literature and becoming a queer literary trope of the rite of passage or finding oneself in the library. And I will in case some of you have not read the last chapter by the time you watch this video, I will save the spoiler alert of the last chapter. I will just say keep your eyes out for this, how to consider the last chapter as avoiding a sense of resolution and yet also finding comfort where we can. So survival in unusual forms or comfort in unusual places, so that this the last chapter of this memoir in terms of queer literature is not what we would expect. And in fact, there's this character who appears who I think in some cases comes out of nowhere and does not necessarily relate to anything else in the book, but that allows the narrator to find solace and to find aspects of himself and to find some type of resolution that also maybe he could not find with other members of his family or peers or lovers throughout the rest of the narrative. So that, if we think about the standard mainstream cis hetero memoir, that we might find more typical types of resolution, such as finding love or getting that job, or I don't know, getting over heartbreak or grief, or all of these things. I think that in this case, yes, the narrator does find a type of resolution, but not necessarily one that we would expect or that fits in with the standard components of plot that one might find in a standard mainstream novel or memoir. I'll stop there for now. This can be part 1 of our analysis and discussion of How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones.